The hotel room looked untouched. The bed was neatly made. The lights were off. The curtains were drawn just enough to let in the Dubai morning sun. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no blood. When the maid knocked and received no answer, she waited. When she entered, she assumed what anyone would assume: a man had died in his sleep. Mahmoud al-Mabhouh lay on the bed, hands folded across his chest, eyes half closed, as if rest had simply gone too far. Hotel security arrived, then local police. The first assessment was routine. Middle-aged man, no visible injuries, no immediate cause for alarm. The room was locked from inside. That detail barely registered at first. It would later become the most important part of the story. Dubai was not a city where murders went unnoticed. Every hallway, elevator, parking garage, and street corner was covered by cameras. Movement was recorded, archived, time-stamped. Nothing disappeared here. If a crime had occurred, the city itself would have seen it. That assumption was about to be tested. Mahmoud al-Mabhouh was not an ordinary guest. He was a senior Hamas commander, responsible for weapons procurement and logistics. He traveled carefully. He used aliases. He chose hotels precisely because they were predictable and quiet. What he did not know was that predictability cuts both ways. Hours after his body was discovered, investigators began pulling footage, not just from a hotel, but from the airport, surrounding streets, taxis, and shopping malls. What they found did not look like a murder. IT looked like tourism, men and women arriving separately on commercial flights, different nationalities, different clothing styles, tennis outfits, business suits, casual travelers with backpacks and rolling luggage. They checked into nearby hotels, used elevators, browsed shops, ate at restaurants. They never arrived together. They never spoke in groups. They never behaved like a team. And yet, frame by frame, something began to emerge. These people crossed paths repeatedly without acknowledging one another. They appeared in the same corridors minutes apart. They passed the same security cameras from different angles. They occupied different rooms on the same floors. Each interaction meant nothing on its own. Together, they formed a shape. Dubai police expanded the timeline, then expanded it again. Eventually, more than 600 hours of footage were synchronized. Every movement before and after al-Mabhouh's arrival was reconstructed. What emerged was not chaos, but choreography. The group had entered Dubai with a single purpose, and they had done so without leaving a mark. Still, there was no clear moment of violence, no weapon captured on camera, no forced entry, no visible confrontation. Al-Mabhouh entered his room alone. No one followed him inside, at least not on any camera. The door never opened again. That was when investigators stopped asking how he died and started asking who had been there before him. Attention shifted backward. Who knew his itinerary? Who arrived just before him? Who left immediately after? Names began to surface, attached to passports from Europe, Australia, and the United Kingdom. At first glance, the documents appeared legitimate. The holders smiled at immigration desks. They passed through border control without delay. But when those passports were examined more closely, something felt wrong. Some numbers repeated across different documents. Some addresses led nowhere. Some identities existed on paper, but nowhere else. A pattern was forming, not in the hotel room, but in the paperwork. Dubai authorities understood what this meant. This was not a crime of opportunity. That IT was not personal. IT was not loud. IT was professional. The investigation was no longer about one death. It was about whether a foreign intelligence service had entered one of the most monitored cities in the world, killed a man in a locked room, and left without being seen at this stage. No one named Mossad publicly. No accusations were made. There was only evidence, quietly accumulating. Every answer raised a more unsettling question. If this had been planned so carefully, if every movement had been calculated in advance, then the killing itself was only the final step. The real operation began long before al-Mabhouh ever checked into that hotel. And whatever had happened inside that room was only possible because of what had already happened outside it. Mahmoud al-Mabhouh arrived in Dubai believing he was ahead of his enemies. He had changed his travel route twice in 48 hours. He booked his flight late, paid in cash, and avoided drawing attention. His alias was clean. His hotel choice was deliberate. Mid-range, international, forgettable, a place where businessmen came and went without questions. He checked in alone. What Al-Mabhouh did not know was that he was already behind. The people investigators would later connect to his death did not follow him into Dubai. They arrived before him, quietly, methodically, some days earlier, some only hours earlier, all on different flights, all carrying different passports, none raising suspicion. They moved like tourists because that is exactly how they were meant to move. One man arrived in tennis shoes and a cap, checking his phone like someone looking for directions. A woman followed the next day, blonde hair tied back, rolling a suitcase through the airport without urgency. Another man wore business attire and asked for a room upgrade and practiced polite English. None of them went near Al-Mabhouh at first. Instead, they learned the terrain. They rode elevators, walked corridors, noted camera angles, timed how long doors stayed open, observed how hotel staff rotated shifts. They mapped the building not with blueprints, but with footsteps. This was not surveillance in the traditional sense. No tails, no confrontations, no eyes locked onto a target. IT was environmental intelligence. By the time Al-Mabhouh landed, the hotel was already familiar to them that Dubai's CCTV system captured everything, but it captured nothing unusual. No one loitered. No one doubled back. No one appeared nervous. The footage showed people waiting for elevators, browsing shops, drinking coffee, checking watches. Normal life. That normality was a disguise. Al-Mabhouh left the airport and took a taxi to his hotel. He carried no visible weapons. He was not followed. He did not sense danger. If he had been watching the cameras himself, he would have seen exactly what everyone else saw. Nothing. The team's movements tightened as his arrival approached. Positions were adjusted. Rooms were changed. One member switched hotels entirely. Another altered appearance, shaving facial hair and changing clothes. Still, no one approached him. That restraint mattered. A rushed operation creates pressure. Pressure creates mistakes. And mistakes, in a city like Dubai, leave records. The city was watching. The team understood that better than anyone on the afternoon of his arrival. Al-Mabhouh left the hotel briefly. He visited a shopping mall nearby. CCTV caught him entering, walking calmly, browsing, blending into the crowd. Several of the same faces appeared in the footage minutes before and after him. Never beside him. Always near enough. Always separate. Investigators would later call this coincidence. Then repetition. Then coordination. What they could not see was a decision-making happening in silence. Al-Mabhouh returned to the hotel early that evening. He did not leave again. He ordered room service. He watched television. He spoke briefly on the phone. Nothing about the footage suggested urgency or fear. At some point, someone else entered the hotel room. Not by force. Not on camera. The key detail would come later. For now, investigators only knew what they could see, and what they could see suggested impossibility. The door log showed no unauthorized entry. The hallway cameras showed no one lingering outside his room. The electronic locks recorded normal usage, and yet Al-Mabhouh never exited alive. This contradiction unsettled the investigators more than the death itself. Crimes leave friction. Violence leaves disruption. But here, everything aligned too smoothly. IT was as if the hotel room had cooperated. As footage continued to be reviewed, attention returned to the people who had arrived before him. Their movements now took on new meaning. Their timing sharpened. Their exits became noticeable. Several of them left Dubai within hours of Al-Mabhouh's death. Some flew back to Europe. Others disappeared into Asia. All before the investigation was public. IT became clear that the operation had not reacted to the killing. IT had concluded. Dubai authorities were no longer reconstructing a murder. They were reconstructing an intelligence operation whose critical decisions had been made long before Al-Mabhouh ever reached his hotel. Which meant the question was no longer how he died. IT was how the room had been entered without the city seeing it, and who was capable of doing that. Dubai investigators began to understand that the hotel room was never the center of the operation, that IT was the endpoint. Every major crime leaves behind a moment where things go wrong. A raised voice, a sudden movement, a trace of panic. In this case, there was none. The absence of friction was itself the clue. Someone had planned the room to remain calm. The key card system showed routine access. The electronic logs recorded nothing unusual. Yet forensic teams knew this only meant one thing. Whatever happened inside had been designed to blend into normal behavior, not interrupt it. The team reviewing the footage shifted focus again. They stopped asking who entered the room. They started asking when the room stopped being safe. The timeline narrowed. Al-Mabhouh returned to his room in the early evening. He was alone. CCTV confirmed it. He ordered food. He made a brief phone call. He did not leave again. There was no knock captured on camera. No raised voices. No sudden exits. Hours later, he was dead. That gap mattered. Forensic analysis suggested a controlled kill. No blunt trauma. No gunshot. No obvious poison detected immediately. His body showed signs consistent with restraint, but not struggle. As if resistance had been brief, deliberate, and immediately neutralized. That detail unsettled investigators. Violence normally announces itself. Even quiet violence leaves traces. Here, the body suggested compliance, not chaos. Someone had approached him in a way that did not trigger alarm, which meant familiarity, authority, or deception. The camera footage offered another clue. In the hours before Al-Mabhouh returned to his room, several individuals associated with the earlier pattern passed to the hotel in close succession. They did not enter his floor at the same time. They did not share elevators. But they overlapped in a way that felt intentional. One person exited as another entered at a relay. Dubai police began mapping movement not by identity but by sequence. Who entered a space just before another left. Who crossed which threshold without overlap. When viewed this way, the footage told a different story. The hotel was not breached all at once. IT was rotated through. This explained the lack of congestion, the absence of groups, the invisibility of teamwork. Each person had a window, a purpose, a short task, and then they vanished back into normal flow. The method did not rely on force. IT relied on timing. Investigators concluded that access to the room had been achieved using duplicated electronic credentials. Not brute force hacking, but something far simpler. Temporary access created through brief contact with the door lock, possibly earlier in the day, enough to neutralize the system later without triggering alarms. The room had been compromised before Al-Mabhouh ever returned. When he entered, he believed he was alone. He wasn't. The killing itself was likely quick, a chemical agent to incapacitate, physical restraint. A final action designed to look natural once the body settled. No mess, no urgency, no visible aftermath. That'd be why the time Al-Mabhouh stopped breathing. The team was already dispersing. This explained the exits. Several suspects left the country within hours, not days. Flights had been booked in advance. Bags were already packed. The operation had an end time, and it was met. Nothing about their departure suggested panic. IT suggested completion. AT this stage. Dubai authorities face a choice. They could treat the case as a sophisticated murder and quietly close it, or they could acknowledge the obvious, that this was not a crime in the conventional sense, that IT was a foreign intelligence operation conducted inside their borders. That decision would define everything that followed. Once that line was crossed, the investigation became less about evidence and more about exposure. Names mattered less than patterns. Accountability mattered less than deterrence. The goal was no longer just to understand how Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh died. IT was to make sure the world knew that Dubai had seen what happened, because silence would signal permission, and permission in intelligence work invites repetition. As footage continued to be compiled, one final realization settled over the investigation team. This operation had not succeeded because it was violent. IT had succeeded because it was quiet, and quiet operations only fail when someone decides to make noise. Dubai authorities chose not to stay quiet. That decision altered the trajectory of the case more than any forensic discovery ever could. Instead of closing the file quietly and issuing routine cause of death, officials took an unusual step. They began releasing information publicly, carefully, selectively, frame by frame, not accusations, evidence. The first release was simple. CCTV stills showing individuals entering and exiting the country. Men and women with ordinary faces, ordinary clothes, ordinary luggage. No weapons. No uniforms. No obvious connection. The world reacted with confusion. Then more footage followed. Split screens. Timelines. Movement charts. The same faces appearing in different locations minutes apart. Elevators. Hotel corridors. Shopping malls. Taxi stands. Always close. Never together. What looked like coincidence began to look deliberate. Dubai police did not name an intelligence agency. They did not need to. The images spoke for themselves. This was not the work of criminals or hired assassins. It was too precise, too clean, too patient. International media seized on the story. Analysts paused footage. Journalists traced passport numbers. Governments began receiving quiet phone calls asking uncomfortable questions. How had these operatives entered your country? Were these passports real? Were your citizens involved? As scrutiny increased, cracks appeared. Several passports used in the operation were traced back to real people, dual nationals, individuals who had never left their home countries. Their identities had been copied, not invented. That detail escalated the situation dramatically. This was no longer just about a killing in a hotel room. It was about the abuse of allied nations' documentation systems, about sovereignty, about trust. Countries demanded explanations. Ambassadors were summoned. Statements were issued, vague and carefully worded. No one admitted responsibility. No one denied it outright. Silence became policy. Inside intelligence circles, the reaction was more complex. Some admired the operation's execution, the discipline, the restraint, the ability to move through one of the most monitored cities in the world without triggering alarms. Others focused on what had gone wrong. Because something had gone wrong. The killing itself may have been flawless, but the aftermath was not. Exposure was never part of the plan. Intelligence work relies on deniability, not recognition. The moment an operation becomes visible, it loses its protective cover. Dubai had forced visibility to be why releasing footage instead of accusations. They had done something intelligence agencies rarely expect. They had turned surveillance back on the surveillors. Every movement was now permanent. Every disguise archived. Every alias frozen in time. The operatives had escaped physically, but their images would never disappear. That carried consequences. Travel became harder. Identities were burned. Patterns once safe became liabilities. Methods had to be reevaluated, not because they failed, but because they had been revealed. Inside the agency responsible, internal reviews began immediately, not to assign blame, but to assess damage. The operation had achieved its objective. Mahmoud al-Mabhouh was dead. Networks were disrupted. Weapons procurement slowed. From a tactical standpoint, it was a success. Strategically, the picture was less clean. Exposure altered future calculations. Cities that once seemed permissive became hostile. Passport controls tightened. CCTV systems were reconfigured. Cooperation between security services increased. The environment shifted. And yet, something else had shifted too. That Dubai's decision sent a message. Not just to one agency, but to all of them. That even the quietest operations could be made loud after the fact. That visibility could be weaponized. That cities could push back not with force, but with transparency. This unsettled the intelligence world. The assumption had always been that secrecy protected everyone. Dubai challenged that. They demonstrated that exposure, when controlled, could be a form of defense. For Mahmoud al-Mabhouh, none of this mattered. His story had ended in that hotel room. But for the method used against him, the story was only halfway done. Because when an operation is seen, it cannot be unseen. Other services would study it, learn from it, adapt it, improve it, or counter it. The game did not pause. IT evolved as the last CCTV images were released and the investigation stabilized. One truth became unavoidable. The death in the hotel room had been silent. The consequences were not. And somewhere inside intelligence agencies around the world, a new question began to replace the old ones. Not how to conduct such an operation, but whether the next one would remain invisible long enough to matter. In the months that followed, the operation stopped being a case and became a reference. Inside intelligence agencies, Mahmoud al-Mabhouh's death was no longer discussed as an event. It was discussed as a scenario, a point on a timeline, a lesson that could not be unlearned. What mattered now was not how the man had died. IT was what the world had seen afterward. Dubai's release of surveillance footage forced a reckoning. For decades, intelligence work had relied on a simple assumption, that even if an operation was suspected, its mechanics would remain hidden, that ambiguity would protect both sides, that silence was safer than sunlight. Dubai proved otherwise to be why exposing the movement rather than the method. They had rewritten the rules. They showed that an intelligence operation could be dismantled in public without revealing classified sources or techniques. Faces, timing, and coordination were enough. That idea spread quickly. Cities began auditing their own surveillance systems, not just for crime prevention, but for pattern recognition. Border agencies started sharing anomaly data more aggressively. Passport authorities reviewed issuance processes not for fraud, but for replication. Nothing was officially linked to the Dubai case. Everything was influenced by it. Inside intelligence agencies, training materials quietly changed. New operatives were taught not just how to blend in, but how to disappear afterward. Identity longevity became as important as access. The question shifted from can we get in to what remains if we're seen? That was a new kind of pressure, because visibility had become permanent. A face captured once could surface years later. A walk through an airport could be replayed endlessly. Digital archives did not forget, and governments were learning how to use them strategically. Operations that once prioritized speed now prioritize sustainability. Fewer people, shorter exposure windows, reduced reliance on allied documentation systems. The tolerance for complexity shrank. Efficiency had been exposed as risk. For the agency believed to be responsible, the internal debate deepened. Some argued that the operation had achieved its objective, and that exposure was an acceptable cost. Others countered that the cost was cumulative, not immediate. Every burned identity narrowed future options. Every exposed method accelerated countermeasures. Every public success planted the seeds of eventual failure. Neither side was entirely wrong that al-Mabhouh's death disrupted weapons pipelines. That impact was real. Intelligence assessments confirmed delays and shortages that rippled outward. For a time, the organization he served moved more cautiously. But caution did not equal collapse. Adaptation followed. Just as intelligence agencies adjusted their methods, so did their adversaries. Travel became more layered. Meetings moved further from predictable spaces. Trust networks tightened. The very visibility of the Dubai operation served as a warning. If this could happen in a city like that, it could happen anywhere. Fear became operational. For intelligence professionals, this was an uncomfortable symmetry. Success had educated both sides equally. The Dubai case also exposed a deeper tension within modern intelligence work. Technology had made surveillance effortless, but effortlessness bred confidence. Confidence encouraged boldness. Boldness invited scrutiny. The cycle fed itself. What had once been extraordinary now felt inevitable, not because intelligence agencies were reckless, but because systems had evolved faster than restraint. The operation's most lasting impact was not procedural. It was psychological. Officers began to assume exposure as a baseline risk, not a failure state, but an outcome to be managed. This altered decision-making in subtle ways. Operations were judged not only on their immediate results, but on their narrative aftermath. How would this look if it surfaced? How long would identity survive? Who would control the story? Those questions had never carried equal weight before. Dubai had made narrative a battlefield. For Mahmoud al-Mabhouh, none of this mattered. His role in the world ended quietly, without confrontation or acknowledgement. His death did not produce headlines at first. It produced footage. And footage proved harder to bury. Years later, intelligence historians would describe the operation as a hinge moment, not because it failed, but because it succeeded too visibly. It marked the transition from an era where secrecy was assumed to one where exposure was expected. The rules had not disappeared. They had tightened, the city had watched, the world had learned, and the intelligence community had been forced to accept an uncomfortable truth, that the most dangerous part of covert operation no longer occurred in the field. IT occurred afterward. Years later, Rome still refused to settle into the past. Not because anyone talked about it openly, but because it never needed to be explained. The operation lived in margins and pauses, in moments when intelligence officers hesitated before approving something that felt too clean. Imad Khalil was gone. That fact never changed. The networks he built fractured, reassembled, and fractured again. Some attacks never happened. Others did. History adjusted in ways that could never be measured precisely enough to claim victory. That was always the problem with success in intelligence work. You never see the alternate future you prevented. The forged stamp protocol never returned in its original form. The world moved on too quickly. Passports became biometric. Stamps faded into databases. Ink gave way to code. But the idea survived intact. Markers replaced stamps. Patterns replaced ink. Systems replaced streets. Targets still carried the tools that revealed them. They always would. Border crossings, financial transfers, phone metadata, airline bookings. The modern world required participation, and participation left traces. Rome proved that intelligence no longer needed proximity. It only needed patience. Inside Mossad, the operation was eventually reclassified again. No longer active. No longer experimental. It became reference material. Something you studied not to copy, but to understand limits. What showed was not how to kill a man without being seen. That IT showed how easily systems designed for order could be bent toward death. That understanding changed training, changed oversight, changed the weight placed on human confirmation. The method forced intelligence agencies to confront a truth they preferred to ignore, that efficiency and restraint do not naturally coexist. The younger generation saw Rome as proof of brilliance. The older generation saw it as proof of danger. Both were right. Neither had the full picture. Somewhere between those views lived a real lesson. The passport that triggered the operation eventually returned to Syria. It sat in an evidence archive. Pages yellowing, stamps fading into meaningless ink. No one looking at it now would see anything remarkable. The digit that once mattered blended back into the noise of paper and bureaucracy. But the infrastructure that noticed it never forgot. That was a legacy, not a death. Not a success, but a shift. The realization that intelligence had crossed into a space where the line between observation and execution could vanish without warning. From that moment on, restraint became as important as innovation, not because intelligence agencies suddenly grew moral, but because they understood risk better. The system that kills silently can kill incorrectly. The method that leaves no evidence leaves no accountability. And accountability, once lost, is almost impossible to rebuild. Rome forced that reckoning without headlines, without outrage, without anyone demanding answers, which made it more effective than any scandal ever could. Imad Khalil died believing he was safe, believing distance protected him, believing routine was harmless. He never saw the marker, never sensed a danger, never understood how ordinary his death would look. That was the point. But the people who built the operation did understand something else by the end, that intelligence work does not end when a target is removed. It continues in what the method becomes afterward, whether it spreads, whether it mutates, whether it is restrained or abused. The Rome operation closed quietly, exactly as intended, and no arrest, and no confessions, and no proof. Only a man who stopped moving, and a system that learned how much power it held. And the world that followed. Intelligence agencies would grow more invisible, more embedded, more patient. The most dangerous operations would no longer announce themselves with explosions or gunfire. They would hide inside routines, inside systems people trusted, inside the paperwork no one questioned. And that may be the most unsettling lesson Rome left behind. Not that intelligence can kill without being seen, but that it can do so without anyone realizing how close they were to being next.